I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, we didn't plan on doing this podcast.
We were forced into it by Elon Musk.
Circumstances, the news. We are the Chinese Literature Podcast, the Chinese Literature Podcast. There are other Chinese literature podcasts out there, and they are excellent. But we feel like we are the representative. And so when there's Chinese literature in the news, we just feel like we have to speak.
It's not just a feeling, man. Someone brings up Chinese literature in the news, they know they're calling us into the discussion, you know? That's just a conscious decision on their part.
Do you think Elon Musk, his tweet was a reference to us? He was calling us in, he just forgot to tag us?
You know what? I think his inspiration for using a Chinese poem in the first place is probably his dedicated attention to our podcast.
I assume that he is actually a listener because, well, I assume I am someone.
Yeah, he's got to be listening to us.
So in case you're wondering, on Tuesday of this week, Elon Musk actually tweeted a 3rd century Chinese poem. This is from Cao Zhi. It was written around 220 AD. The document that it's from is called the 世说新语. Yeah, I don't even know how to translate that. Rob, do you have any help for me there?
Something like, talk about the world, new talk about the world, something like that.
New language about the world. The poem is from, not a poet really, but I guess he was a poet, but a politician. He's more famous as the 3rd son of Cao Cao, the famous sort of Machiavellian figure from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, the 三国志. And there is a historical moment around 220 AD where Cao Cao dies, and it's not clear who's going to take over. The second brother, Cao Pi, eventually takes the throne, and he's a little worried about his little brother, number 3, Cao Zhi, taking over and trying to overthrow him and kill him. Cao Zhi realizes that Cao Pi is thinking about eliminating him the old-fashioned way. Cao Zhi writes this poem, and maybe I should just read the poem.
First of all, what's it called?
The poem has a weird name. I don't actually know the origin, but it's the 7-step poem. Rob, do you know the history of that, or why did it get that name?
I don't. I really don't.
But that's what it's called, the 7-step poem. So here is my translation of it. One boils beans by igniting beanstalks. The beans in the kettle sob. We were born out of the same roots. To fry together, why be this rash?
So the beans, asking the beanstalks, basically, what's up, dude? I thought we were friends. That sort of thing. You were asking me before we did this, what do you want to just talk about with this poem? And I went, I don't know, really. There's not much in the poem. It honestly sort of, the story, the history of it's kind of appropriate because it does feel like the kind of thing a younger brother would write, not sure what else to say. He feels like he's getting picked on. And this is kind of like, come on, dude, seriously, I thought we were brothers, supposed to be friends. Like, it's not a particularly eloquent way to do it.
I actually found the metaphor. I mean, you're right. This poem is not. This is not Li Bai or whatever. But I found the metaphor of the bean and the beanstalk, and the beanstalk being used to destroy the bean, to cook the bean. Kind of, I thought it was really good. I loved it.
It's a neat image. But it's one of those poems where you read it and you go, wow, that's a neat image. I guess that's about all we got. It's very clever, but there's not anything particularly noteworthy beyond that for me.
We did a Song Dynasty poem last week on the podcast, and we were going to do a Song Dynasty poem this week on the podcast, and that's going to get pushed to the following week. The Song Dynasty is so eloquent, and they're using this recondite, really hard to understand language and allusions oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes they're very much kind of praising the Tang Dynasty and saying this is amazing stuff, but they also have this very kind of academic-y feel to it, right?
Sure.
Like it's a scholar writing it. It's good to remind us that actually some Chinese poetry is just
it's really simple. Yeah,
it's really simple. All right,
right, and that the origins of it. I mean, depending on whose history you read, whether it's popular history or well-researched history, is always that all Chinese poetry just comes from folk songs. Just people sitting around telling stories, singing about stuff, right? Yeah, this poem, and among others, just reminds us that here's what the roots of Chinese poetry are. You could argue all poetry. It's just people talking about stuff, really.
A month or two ago, we did a podcast on the Guan Guan Goes the Osprey from the Shi Jing, and that poem, that collection of poems from the Shi Jing, the classic of poetry or the Book of Odes, it's called, translated in different ways. Those are all supposedly, now this is just very much, I should say purportedly, those are very much coming out of this tradition of folk songs. Now they're so well crafted that it's pretty clear that they're not really folk songs, and they may never have been. But there is always this, from the very beginning of Chinese literature, from those first poems that are ever written that we have today still in the Chinese tradition, there is this kind of evocation of like a simplicity that just sometimes gets lost. And so it's good to read a poem like Cao Zhi's and get us back, let's just have a good poem, pretty simple.
So, the obvious place to go with this next is, what the heck is Elon Musk doing with this poem? If what you're trying to demonstrate is, look, man, I'm smart and I know my stuff, you're going to probably bring in a heavier hitter in Chinese poetry. You're going to bring in a Li Bai, or if you really want to show your stuff, you bring in like a Wang Wei or someone who's well-known, but, a little below the radar. Like one of the bands in the Seattle grunge scene that no one really listened to at the time, but actually was really awesome. That's the kind of thing you do. He's not trying to be cool. What is he doing?
Well, there goes our first musical reference of the podcast, a reference to the grunge scene. Thank you, Rob.
Each podcast has to have one.
So, Rob, what you're saying is maybe Elon Musk, maybe he doesn't listen to our podcast because he's not alluding to the right poet? Is that what you're suggesting?
Or maybe he's crying for help. Guys, you're so much more educated than me, and this is the best thing I could come up with. Please help me find better tweets. Elon, if you're listening, we can help you find better tweets. Absolutely.
I would say he should call us, but actually he should just send his private plane. He is the world's richest person.
It's true. Or send us a bunch of Bitcoins, however you want to communicate. But it is curious. It is curious because we've done another podcast where a different businessman used a
different
poem,
billionaire.
But that was a Chinese billionaire. And that kind of made sense because of his audience, right? His audience is going to know the material. They're going to get, I see, interesting that he's using this poem. Elon Musk has, I don't even know how many people on following his tweets. How many of those people are going to catch any sort of significance behind a Chinese poem?
Well, considering that Twitter is banned in China, I think it will probably be fairly limited. Just very briefly, what happened is apparently this may be an allusion to a fight that's going on between two different forms of cryptocurrency. That is, there are two different competing forms that are fighting with each other. I think it's Dogecoin, and Rob, you and I know nothing about cryptocurrencies, right?
Zero, but clearly the Chinese did many, many, many centuries ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Chinese actually invented cryptocurrency 5,000 years ago.
That's what the beans and the beanstalks are referring to. You're big on symbols. I think the beans and the beanstalks are rival crypto firms.
But that is actually what apparently happened. They're rival cryptocurrencies, and he's saying, we all need to get along. That apparently is Elon Musk his point.
Well, and it's interesting because you don't have to know anything about Chinese poetry to read this poem as anything other than like a boo-hoo sort of thing, right? Like, leave me alone, or why can't we just get along, It's funny because if his point was, not only do we need to get along, our particular spat here is so ridiculous and silly, I'm just going to use this thing. It's kind of clever, but once again, why dredge through history to find this? Is this the cleverest way to say it? Or is there some way of bringing China into it that's some kind of subtext? Maybe
Elon Musk is just that much of a genius that he's just reading Chinese literature and he just kind of comes up with this reference. He was reading a book on early imperial Chinese poetry a couple of days ago, and he remembered this poem and was like, this would be the perfect metaphor. But yeah, he tweeted this in Chinese. I think he titled the poem in English, Humanity, which is that's his own edition, but as many other scholars throughout Chinese literature have done, Elon Musk is adding a bit to this poem.
Yes, just a bit. Like I say, if he had tweeted a poem with a lot more historical references and a lot of in jokes, you could read more into the subtext here.
Rob, I think it's weird because you're being the area studies guy and I'm being the comparatist who's just like, yeah, it's cool if Elon Musk wants to tweet a Chinese poem. You don't have to have a PhD.
But that's always my favorite question is why this thing? There's so many ways to say this. Why this way? There's so much of that. Why is this popular? Why not that? Why this poem? Why not just say, hey, can't we all just get along? Use a pop song that talks about that?
But that's more of our calling card than his. I think that my thing would just be, I'm really glad he used this poem. I actually had not read this poem, so I'm super happy that he did this.
Wow. So does he know more about Chinese literature than us? Because that'd be pretty sad.
It'd be embarrassing.
Not only is he changing the future, but he's barging in on our territory.
So I'm glad that Chinese literature is once again in the news. I would just say to any listeners out there who happen to be billionaires, if you're going to tweet about a Chinese poem, send us an email at ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com and have a conversation before you do that. Of course, Elon Musk is more than welcome to contribute to our Patreon account.
Absolutely, Elon. Chinese Literature Podcast at Patreon. We can even start up a special subscription service just for you where we send you poetry references that are going to make you sound not only cool and educated, but also help you to have a really subtle and interesting jab, a point.
Elon, we're actually willing to even turn a Chinese poem into an NFT for you. And those of y'all who know crypto will get that reference. I think that's a great place to end it, Rob. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.